For 6 years, I drove my mother to dialysis 3 times a week. For 6 years, I managed her medications, her doctors, her bad days, and her worse ones. For 6 years, I put my own life in a drawer and told myself I'd get to it later. My brother called on holidays. That was the extent of it. So, when the attorney read my mother's will and every asset, the house, the savings, the lake property our grandfather had left her, went to him, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I sat very still while my brother tried not to smile, and when the lawyer closed the folder, I reached into my bag, set an envelope on the table, and said, "Mom asked me to wait until now. My name is Rachel, and I was 34 years old the day I learned that some gifts don't show up where you're looking." My mother's decline didn't happen all at once. It crept in sideways, the way these things do. A missed pill here, a forgotten name there. Then a fall in the kitchen that put her in the hospital for 4 days. And after that, nothing was ever quite the same. I was the one who got the call from the hospital because I was listed as her emergency contact, not because anyone had decided that on purpose, just because I lived 20 minutes away, and my brother, Greg, lived in Denver, almost 1,500 miles from our hometown outside Pittsburgh. I want to be fair about this, because fairness matters to me, even now. Greg wasn't a bad person. He had a job in tech that paid well, a wife, 2 kids in elementary school, a mortgage that probably kept him up at night. Distance is real. Life is real. But there's a difference between being far away and being absent, and somewhere around year 2 of Mom's decline, I stopped being able to tell myself those were the same thing. Every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, I drove her to the dialysis center on Route 30, sat in the waiting room with a paperback I never finished because I spent the whole time watching the clock, then drove her home and made sure she ate something before the nausea hit. Every other week, I sat with the insurance company on hold for 45 minutes at a time, fighting over a claim that should never have been denied in the first place. I learned more about Medicare supplemental plans than any accountant. I learned how to change a catheter dressing without flinching. I learned that grief can start years before someone actually dies. That you can mourn a person while they're still sitting across the table from you, still telling the same story about the Pirates game in 1979 for the 100th time. My own life didn't stop exactly. It just got smaller. I worked part-time as a paralegal at a firm downtown, a job I'd once hoped would turn into something more. But every time an opportunity came up that required travel or longer hours, I had to say no. I'd had a relationship with a man named David that ended quietly after 2 years, not because anything dramatic happened, but because I was always tired, always somewhere else in my head, always waiting for my phone to ring with bad news. He didn't do anything wrong by leaving. I understood it even while it hurt. Greg visited 4 times in 6 years. I know because I kept track, not out of spite, but because my mother used to ask me, almost apologetically, when he was coming again, and I needed to have an answer ready. Christmas sometimes. A few days in the summer. Once, memorably, for our mother's 75th birthday, when he flew in with his family, took photos in front of her rose bushes, posted them online with a caption about how much he loved his mom, and flew out 48 hours later. My mother defended him the way mothers do. "He has a family of his own now," she'd say. "He has responsibilities." I never argued with her about it. What would have been the point? She wanted to believe her children loved her equally, and in her own way, maybe we did. We just showed it differently. I showed it by being there. Greg showed it through a screen, a phone call every few weeks, a check-in that always seemed to come right before something he needed to ask for. Advice on a house he was thinking of buying, an opinion on a school district, things that had nothing to do with her and everything to do with using her as a sounding board for his own life. Neighbors started to notice. Mrs. Alvarez next door used to wave at me from her porch and say, "Your mother's lucky to have you, sweetheart." And I'd smile and keep walking because I didn't know what else to do with that kind of comment. I never wanted credit. I wanted, if I'm honest with myself now, for it to simply be acknowledged that what I was doing mattered. Not paid for. Not rewarded. Just seen. If I'm being completely honest, somewhere in the back of my mind, I assumed the will would reflect what had actually happened in those 6 years. Not because I felt entitled to anything. I want to be clear about that. But because it seemed like the natural order of things. The person who shows up gets remembered. That's not greed. That's just logic. My mother passed away on a Tuesday morning in March, with sleet hitting the hospital window and a nurse named Donna holding her other hand. I was holding the one closer to me. She'd been asking for water, and then she wasn't asking for anything, and the machines made their sound, and that was it. 6 years of appointments and medications and worry ended in about 90 seconds. The funeral was at St. Brigid's, the church she'd attended since before I was born. Greg flew in the day before and left the day after, which I noted but said nothing about. People came up to me afterward, people I barely recognized from her old book club, her quilting circle, women who'd known her for decades, and they all said some version of the same thing. You were so good to her. I thanked them and meant it, and tried not to think too hard about what came next. What came next was a Thursday afternoon 2 weeks later, in a conference room at a law office on Forbes Avenue, with wood paneling, and a framed print of the Pittsburgh skyline that I would end up staring at for most of the meeting. The attorney was a calm, careful man named Mr. Whitfield, who had handled my mother's affairs for nearly 15 years. Greg showed up in a sport coat I didn't recognize, looking more nervous than I expected, which I chalked up at the time to grief, though I would later wonder if it meant something else. Mr. Whitfield opened the folder. He read through the preliminary language, the standard legal phrasing that means nothing until it suddenly means everything. Then he got to the distribution. The house on Maple Court, to Greg, the savings account, just over $200,000 accumulated over a lifetime of careful budgeting, to Greg. The cabin at Deep Creek Lake, the one her own father had built with his hands in the 50s, the one I'd spent every July of my childhood at, to Greg. I sat there and felt the room get very quiet, the way a room does right before something happens. I could feel people's eyes on me. My Aunt Linda was there, a couple of cousins, even Mrs. Alvarez, who'd come out of respect. Everyone waiting to see what I'd do. Whether I'd cry or object or finally say all the things I'd swallowed for 6 years. Across the table, Greg wasn't quite able to keep his expression neutral. There was something underneath his careful, somber face. Something that looked almost like relief, and for just a second, I thought I saw the corner of his mouth twitch upward before he caught himself. I didn't say anything. I didn't trust myself to. Mr. Whitfield finished reading and closed the folder, and for a moment nobody moved. Then I reached into my bag, the same leather tote I'd carried to every single one of my mother's appointments for 6 years, and I pulled out an envelope. It was cream-colored, slightly worn at the corners from however long it had been sitting wherever she'd kept it, and across the front, in her handwriting. The same handwriting that used to sign my school permission slips. Were the words, "For after the will. Give this to the lawyer." I set it on the table. She asked me to bring this, I said. She told me not to open it, just to hand it over once everything else had been read. Greg's face changed. Whatever relief had been sitting there a moment ago evaporated. "What is that?" he asked, and his voice had an edge to it I hadn't heard from him in years. Mr. Whitfield picked up the envelope carefully, turned it over once, and used a letter opener from his desk drawer to slit it open. He unfolded 2 sheets of paper, lined notebook paper, the kind my mother always used for grocery lists and notes to herself, and began to read aloud. If you're hearing this, then the will has already been read, and Rachel is probably sitting there wondering why I didn't leave her the house, or the cabin, or any of it. Greg, I imagine you're feeling something different. I'd ask you both to just listen before you react. The room had gone completely still. I could hear the radiator ticking somewhere along the wall. Rachel, I need you to understand something first, because I know how your mind works, and I know you'll spend weeks turning this over if I don't say it plainly. This was never about who loved me more. You drove me to appointment after appointment. You sat with me through nights I don't even remember now because of the medication, and you never once made me feel like a burden, even when I'm sure I was one. I saw all of it. Every bit. I want you to know that before you hear the rest. My throat had closed up. I stared at the table because I couldn't look at anyone. Greg, I love you too, and I don't want this letter to be the thing that breaks something between you and your sister. But I have to be honest with both of you now, in a way I never quite managed while I was alive. You built a good life, and I'm proud of you for that. But a good life 800 miles away doesn't change the fact that for 6 years, your sister was the one in the room, and you were the one on the phone. That's not a judgment. It's just the truth, and I think you already know it. Across the table, Greg had gone pale. He wasn't looking at anyone either. Mr. Whitfield turned to the second page, and something in his own expression shifted. The practiced neutrality of an attorney giving way, just slightly, to something more like surprise. What I left in the will is not everything I have, he read. 8 years ago, after your father passed, I worked with a different attorney, someone outside this firm, to set up a trust. Most of what's in it isn't anything either of you have ever seen. Some investments your father started decades ago that grew quietly over time. A small commercial property in town I never told either of you I'd bought, and the rights to your grandfather's patent on the irrigation valve, which, as it turns out, has been generating royalty income for longer than I let on. None of this was part of probate. None of it could be touched by anyone but the person I named. A murmur went through the room. My Aunt Linda actually put her hand to her chest. The trustee and the sole beneficiary of everything inside it is Rachel. I heard Greg exhale audibly. I didn't look at him. I was too busy trying to remember how to breathe myself. I want to explain why I structured it this way, because I don't want either of you thinking this was a game, or a test, or some kind of trick. The will was meant to provide for stability. A house, savings, something tangible and immediate, and I made my choices there based on need, because Greg, with the kids and the mortgage and everything else, needs that kind of stability more than your sister does right now. But the trust is different. The trust required someone I trusted completely, someone who had already shown me, year after year, that they could be responsible for something fragile and important without ever once asking for anything in return. Rachel, you did that for 6 years with me. I had no doubt who that person should be. My vision had blurred entirely by this point. I wasn't sobbing, not in a way anyone could hear. But the tears were just running, steady and quiet. I know this might look unfair on paper. I know Greg might read this and feel like he's being punished for choices he made in good faith, building a life far from home. That isn't what this is. I love you both exactly the same amount, in the only way a mother can. But love and trust aren't always the same currency. And I think, somewhere in your hearts, you both already understand that. Rachel, don't let this turn into a victory. That was never the point, and if you let it become one, you'll have missed everything I was trying to tell you. Greg, don't let it turn into a wound you carry forever. Your sister never asked for any of this. She just kept showing up, day after day, when it would have been so easy not to. That's all I ever wanted either of you to learn from me, really. Showing up is the whole thing. It was always the whole thing. Mr. Whitfield set the pages down. Nobody spoke. I could hear the elevator dinging somewhere down the hall, ordinary sounds from an ordinary building, while the 6 of us sat there in that conference room with everything rearranged. Greg finally looked at me. I braced myself for anger, and maybe I deserved to brace myself for it, because anger would have been an understandable response. But what I saw instead was something quieter, something closer to shame. I didn't know, he said. So softly I almost didn't catch it, about any of it. The dialysis, the falls, I knew the words, but I didn't. He stopped himself. I should have come home more. I didn't say it's fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and I've never been good at lying, especially not to my own brother. What I said was, you can still show up now. It's not too late for that part. I could have said more. I could have listed every missed call, every excuse, every photo op disguised as a visit. There was a version of that afternoon where I let 6 years of quiet resentment finally have its say, in front of an audience, with the moral high ground sitting right there in my lap. I thought about it. I'm not going to pretend I didn't. But that wasn't what my mother had asked of me, not really. She hadn't written that letter to hand me a trophy. She'd written it to tell me, in the only language she had left, that none of it had gone unnoticed. The medications, the waiting rooms, the years that quietly disappeared while I wasn't looking. She'd seen all of it, and in the end, that was worth more to me than anything with a dollar figure attached to it. So I folded the letter back along its original creases, the way you fold something you intend to keep for a long time, and I didn't make a speech. Greg and I sat in the parking lot afterward for almost an hour, talking in a way we hadn't in years, about her, about him, about the version of family we still might be able to build out of what was left. It wasn't a clean ending. Grief doesn't work that way, and neither does forgiveness. But it was a start, and starts are usually all any of us get. My mother used to say that money tells you what someone has. It doesn't tell you who they are. I understand now what she meant by that, in a way I couldn't have before those 6 years, before that letter, before I watched my brother's face change in that conference room. The house and the savings went to the person who needed stability. The trust went to the person she trusted with everything that mattered most. And me, I didn't walk out of that office feeling rich. I walked out feeling like, for the first time since the day she got sick, somebody had finally said my name out loud and meant it.